Hello and welcome back. Today we'll be reading chapters 11 and 12 of Holes. But as always, before we get started, I want to take a moment to discuss some of the questions you were asked to respond to yesterday. Yesterday we read chapters 9 and 10, and your focus was being able to answer explicit and implicit questions using details from the text. Now, in chapter 9, you were asked to answer an explicit question. It was a little bit trickier to find, though. Your question was, what was the nickname that X-Ray gave Stanley? So, in the beginning, we see this name Caveman appear, right? And more towards the middle of this chapter, we can notice that Stanley says, the last thing he wanted to do after killing himself all day on the lake was to get in a fight with a boy called Caveman. He was glad X-Ray and Armpit had come to his rescue. So at this point, he thinks that the person that he irritated or got in the way of was named Caveman. But then later in that chapter, Stanley begins to make that connection that this is actually the nickname that X-Ray has given Stanley when they say, "Come on, Caveman. Dinner," said Armpit. "You coming, Caveman?" said Squid. Stanley looked around to see that Armpit and Squid were talking to him. Sure, he said. So this is the text evidence that supports that's actually the nickname that they gave him. Now, if we move on to chapter 10, you were asked to make an inference on why the boys always line up for water in the same order, and then what is the significance of this order to the story. So we can see in this chapter that, I'm going to read this paragraph for you where it talks about the boys lining up. The truck stopped and the boys lined up. They always lined up in the same order, Stanley realized, no matter who got there first. X-Ray was always at the front of the line, then came Armpit, Squid, Zigzag, Magnet, and Zero. So at a first glance, we can see that X-Ray is always in the front and Zero is always in the back, right? So thinking about how these characters, what kind of roles these characters play in the story, we can quickly understand that, well, X-Ray is kind of this dominant boy, right? A lot of the boys follow him. He kind of calls the shots. Whereas Zero, who's in the back of the line, is somebody who the boys say got his nickname because there's nothing in his head, right? There's zero in his brain. So this is not somebody that they trust, that they respect. So you can see the two kind of ends of the spectrum here, right? So we can infer that this order has to do with dominance, kind of, right? Loyalty and maybe some trust, right? So X-Ray in the front of the line is somebody who's trusted a lot, who's loyal to the boys, who they go to for maybe questions. He kind of calls the shots, whereas Zero is somebody who they don't pay much attention to, and Zero doesn't really pay much attention to them. Now, we can infer that the more trust, the closer maybe to the front that you'll move. So making those connections is sometimes difficult in the text, but it's always important to pay really close attention to those small details that will help you answer those questions. But we'll begin on our reading for today. As I said, we're going to read chapters 11 and 12. And your focus is going to be, I can use specific details from the text when describing characters, settings, and events. So if you would like to get out those questions so that you can have them in front of you, that might be a good idea to do so. You can jot some notes when you go to answer those later on. In chapter 11, you're going to be thinking about an event that takes place. What does X-Ray ask Stanley to do? And why does Stanley agree to this? I also asked you to make a text-to-self connection, thinking about putting yourself in those shoes. What maybe would you have done in this situation? Chapter 11. Stanley returned to his hole. It wasn't fair. Mr. Pendenski had even said his fossil was interesting. He slammed his shovel into the ground and pried up another piece of earth. After a while, he noticed X-Ray had come by and was watching him dig. "Hey, caveman, let me talk to you a second," X-Ray said. Stanley put down his shovel and stepped up out of his hole. "Say, listen," said X-Ray. "If you find something else, give it to me, okay?" Stanley wasn't sure what to say to X-Ray. X-Ray was clearly the leader of the group, and Stanley didn't want to get in his bad side. "You're new here, right?" said X-Ray. "I've been here for almost a year. I've never found anything. You know, my eyesight's not so good. No one knows this, but you know why my name's X-Ray?" Stanley shrugged one shoulder. "It's Pig Latin for Rex. That's all. I'm too blind to find anything." Stanley tried to remember how Pig Latin worked. X-Ray went on, "Why should you get a whole day off when you've only been here for a couple days? If anybody gets a day off, it should be me. That's only fair, right?" "I guess," Stanley agreed. X-Ray smiled. "You're a good guy, caveman." Stanley picked up his shovel. The more he thought about it, the more he was glad that he agreed to let X-Ray have anything he might find. If he was going to survive at Camp Green Lake, it was far more important that X-Ray think he was a good guy than it was for him to get one day off. Besides, he didn't expect to find anything anyway. There probably wasn't anything of interest out there, and even if there was, he'd never been what you'd call lucky. He slammed his blade into the ground, then dumped out another shovelful of dirt. It was a little surprising, he thought, that X-Ray was the leader of the group, since he obviously wasn't the biggest or the toughest. In fact, except for Zero, X-Ray was the smallest. Armpit was the biggest. Zigzag may have been taller than Armpit, but that's only because of his neck. Yet Armpit and all the others seemed to be willing to do whatever X-Ray asked of them. As Stanley dug up another shovelful of dirt, it occurred to him that Armpit wasn't the biggest. He, the caveman, was bigger. He was glad they called him caveman. It meant they'd accepted him as a member of the group. He would have been glad even if they'd called him Barf Bag. It was really quite remarkable to him. At school, bullies like Derek Doon used to pick on him, yet Derek Doon would be scared senseless of any of the boys here. As he dug his hole, Stanley thought about what it would be like if Derek Doon had to fight Armpit or Squid. Derek Doon wouldn't stand a chance. He imagined what it would be like if he became good friends with all of them, and then for some reason, they all went to him with his school, and then Derek Doon tried to steal his notebook. "Just what do you think you're doing?" asked Squid, as he slams his hand into Derek Doon's smug face. "Caveman's our friend," said Armpit, grabbing him by the shirt collar. Stanley played the scene over and over in his mind, each time watching another boy from Group D beat up Derek Doon. It helped them dig his hole and ease his own suffering. Whatever pain he felt was being felt 10 times worse by Derek. So that's chapter 11. In chapter 12, we still have the same I can statement, but here you're going to think about what does Stanley gain when he agrees to help X-Ray, and then maybe what does he lose? Chapter 12. Again, Stanley was the last one to finish digging. It was late afternoon when he dragged himself back to the compound. This time, he would have accepted a ride on a truck if it was offered. When he got to the tent, he found Mr. Pendenski and the other boys sitting in a circle on the ground. "Welcome, Stanley," said Mr. Pendenski. "Hey, caveman, get your hole dug?" asked Magnet. He managed to nod. "You spit in it?" asked Squid. He nodded again. "You're right," he said to X-Ray. "The second hole is the hardest." X-Ray shook his head. "The third hole is the hardest," he said. "Come join our circle," said Mr. Pendenski. Stanley plopped down between Squid and Magnet. He needed to rest up before taking a shower. "We've been discussing what we want to do with our lives," said Mr. Pendenski. "We're not going to be at Camp Green Lake forever. We need to prepare for the day we leave here and join the rest of society." "Hey, that's great, Mom," said Magnet. "They're going to finally get you out of here?" The other boys laughed. "Okay, Jose," said Mr. Pendensky. What do you want to do with your life? I don't know, said Magnet. You need to think about that, said Mr. Pendensky. It's important to have goals. Otherwise, you're going to end up right back in jail. What do you like to do? I don't know, said Magnet. You must like something, said Mr. Pendensky. I like animals, said Magnet. Good, said Mr. Pendensky. Does anyone know of any jobs that involve animals? Veterinarian, said Armpit. That's right, said Mr. Pendensky. He could work in a zoo, said Zigzag. He belongs in the zoo, said Squid. Then he and X-Ray laughed. How about you, Stanley? Any ideas for Jose? Stanley sighed. Animal trainer, he said. Like for the circus or movies or something like that. Any of those jobs sound good to you, Jose? Asked Mr. Pendensky. Yeah, I like what Caveman said about training animals for movies. I think it would be fun to train monkeys. X-Ray laughed. Don't laugh, Rex, said Mr. Pendensky. We don't laugh at people's dreams. Someone is going to have to train monkeys for the movies. Who are you kidding, Mom? Asked X-Ray. Magnet's never going to be a monkey trainer. You don't know that, said Mr. Pendensky. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Nothing in life is easy. But that's no reason to give up. You'll be surprised what you can accomplish if you set your mind to it. After all, you only have one life, so you should try to make the most of it. Stanley tried to figure out what he'd say if Mr. Pendensky asked him what he wanted to do with his life. He used to think he wanted to work for the FBI, but this didn't seem the appropriate place to mention that. So far, you've all done a pretty good job at messing up your lives, said Mr. Pendensky. I know you think you're cool. He looked at Stanley. So, you're Caveman now, huh? You like digging holes, Caveman? Stanley didn't know what to say. Well, let me tell you something, Caveman. You are here on account of one person. If it wasn't for that person, you wouldn't be here digging holes in the hot sun. You know who that person is? My no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather? The other boys howled with laughter. Even Zero smiled. It was the first time Stanley had ever seen Zero smile. He usually had such an angry expression on his face. Now he had such a huge smile and it almost seemed too big for his face. Like the smile on a jack-o'-lantern. No, said Mr. Pendensky. That person is you, Stanley. You're the reason you're here. You're responsible for yourself. You messed up your life, and it's up to you to fix it. No one else is going to do it for you, for any of you. Mr. Pendensky looked from one boy to another. You're all special in your own way, he said. You've all got something to offer. You have to think about what you want to do. Then do it. Even you, Zero. You're not completely worthless. The smile was now gone from Zero's face. What do you want to do with your life? Mr. Pendensky asked him. Zero's mouth was shut tight. As he glanced at Mr. Pendensky, his dark eyes seemed to expand. What about it, Zero? Asked Mr. Pendensky. What do you like to do? I like to dig holes. All right, that was the end of chapter 12. Go ahead and use your notes, respond to your questions, add to your character journal, and I will see you back tomorrow.